Every empire believes it will be the exception, not because its leaders are foolish, but because its systems appear more advanced, more flexible, more intelligent than anything that came before. There is always a moment when prosperity feels permanent, when problems seem manageable, and when decline feels like something that happens to others in other eras, under different conditions. That moment is not the peak, it is the warning. History shows that empires do not collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they are convinced recovery is guaranteed, when every signal of stress is interpreted as temporary, when adaptation replaces correction. That is the exact stage where recovery quietly ends, the stage where systems stop healing and start compensating, the stage where survival depends not on strength but on belief. From the outside, this phase looks stable. Markets still function. Institutions still operate. Daily life continues with familiar routines. But beneath that surface, something has changed. The system has crossed from resilience into dependency. It no longer absorbs shocks. It deflects them. It no longer corrects imbalances. It postpones them. And every postponement increases the cost of reversal. This is the point most people miss, because nothing appears broken yet. In fact, things often look better than ever. Asset values are high. Confidence is reinforced. Participation expands. That apparent strength is what makes this stage so dangerous. Because when recovery depends on maintaining momentum, slowing down becomes impossible. Ancient Rome reached this stage long before its fall became visible. Currency debasement was introduced not as a sign of desperation, but as a clever solution, a way to fund obligations without raising taxes. It worked at first. Trade continued, the empire functioned, but trust eroded quietly. Prices rose, confidence thinned. Each adjustment required another. The system adapted, but it never recovered its original stability. By the time the consequences became undeniable, reversal was no longer an option without tearing the empire apart. The same pattern appeared centuries later in imperial Spain, then in Britain, then in countless lesser powers. Different technologies, different currencies, identical logic. What defines this stage is not decline, but rigidity. The system becomes too complex, too leveraged, and too interconnected to tolerate honest failure. In earlier phases, mistakes are corrected through loss. Bad investments fail. Weak institutions collapse. Pain is concentrated, but recovery follows. In the late stage, failure becomes unacceptable. Loss is feared not because it is destructive, but because it reveals fragility. So systems are redesigned to prevent visible failure at all costs. Bailouts replace bankruptcies. Liquidity replaces discipline. Confidence replaces caution. These measures feel responsible. They are praised as leadership, but they come with a hidden trade-off. They teach participants that risk no longer carries consequences. Over time, behavior adjusts accordingly. As this stage deepens, growth changes character. It stops being expansion and becomes maintenance. Governments borrow not to build, but to sustain existing promises. Corporations borrow not to innovate, but to inflate valuations. Individuals borrow not to advance, but to keep up. Debt shifts from being a tool to being a requirement. And once a system depends on future promises to support present stability, recovery becomes politically and psychologically intolerable. Any attempt to reduce obligations feels like betrayal. Any correction feels like collapse. So leaders delay. Delay becomes policy. Policy becomes structure. This is where belief takes over. The system must be trusted to function. Not trusted because it is healthy, but trusted because alternatives are worse. Participation becomes compulsory. Opting out feels dangerous. Saving feels punished. Risk-taking feels necessary. The system trains its participants through incentives rather than force. Over time, entire populations internalize these rules. They defend the system not because it serves them well, but because their survival feels tied to it. This is the moment empires stop recovering, not when collapse is inevitable, but when correction is no longer acceptable. In the modern era, this stage has been reached under the banner of stability. Financial crises were met with extraordinary interventions. Each one was framed as temporary. Each one expanded expectations. Markets learned that losses would be softened. Institutions learned that scale meant protection. Governments learned that postponement was preferable to pain. None of these lessons were taught deliberately. They emerged organically, and once learned, they reshaped behavior everywhere. Risk increased, leverage normalized, complexity became camouflage. The system grew larger, louder, and more confident, even as its tolerance for error vanished. Empires at this stage often mistake continuity for recovery. As long as the system continues, leaders assume it can heal. But continuation is not healing. A system that cannot contract cannot recover. It can only inflate or fracture. The illusion of control persists until belief shifts. And belief always shifts faster than institutions expect. When that happens, the same mechanisms that sustain stability amplify stress. Interventions signal fear. Guarantees raise suspicion. Confidence rituals lose their power. The tools still exist, but their effects reverse. This is why history feels repetitive in hindsight. Not because leaders fail to learn, but because systems incentivize the same decisions under pressure. Each empire believes it can manage decline gradually. Each underestimates how quickly perception changes once trust erodes. By the time doubt spreads beyond elites and into the public consciousness, recovery is no longer possible on the system's own terms. Change arrives from outside the framework, through shocks, restructurings, or transformations that feel sudden only because the crossing of the line went unnoticed. We are living in that stage now. Not at the moment of collapse, but at the moment where genuine recovery has become incompatible with how the system functions. That does not mean the end is immediate. Late-stage empires can persist for years, even decades. But they persist by moving forward only, narrowing their options with every step. Understanding this stage is not about predicting disaster. It is about recognizing limits. Because the most dangerous belief an empire can hold is not that it is strong, but that it is incapable of reaching a point of no return. History suggests otherwise, and history is rarely wrong at this stage. Once an empire enters this stage, its priorities begin to invert. What once mattered most, long-term strength, adaptability, and social trust, slowly give way to short-term continuity. The goal is no longer to build something that can endure stress, but to prevent stress from being visible at all. This shift happens quietly, often framed as modernization or risk management. New tools are introduced to smooth volatility. New institutions are created to coordinate responses. New narratives emerge to reassure participants that instability has been mastered. On the surface, this looks like progress. Underneath, it marks the loss of resilience, because resilience requires the ability to fail in small ways. Late-stage systems cannot allow that. In earlier phases, failure serves a purpose. It clears excess. It forces adaptation. It signals when assumptions are wrong. But in the stage where empires stop recovering, failure becomes dangerous, not because of its direct impact, but because of what it reveals. A single collapse threatens confidence in the entire structure, so it must be prevented. Losses are absorbed, delayed, or transferred. Weakness is hidden. Over time, this creates a system where inefficiency accumulates, bad decisions survive, fragile structures persist. The system grows larger, but also more brittle. It appears strong precisely because it has not been tested honestly in a long time. Debt plays a central role in this transformation. In healthy systems, debt is temporary. It pulls future capacity forward to fund productive growth. In late-stage systems, debt becomes permanent. It is used to sustain obligations that no longer generate returns. Governments borrow to fund existing programs. Corporations borrow to maintain stock prices. Individuals borrow to preserve living standards. None of these actors intend to cause harm. Each responds rationally to the incentives they face, but collectively they create a structure where tomorrow is constantly sacrificed to stabilize today. This is the moment when recovery quietly disappears, because recovery would require reducing obligations, accepting losses, and enduring contraction. And contraction becomes politically, socially, and psychologically unacceptable. As debt becomes foundational, policy changes character. Interest rates stop reflecting risk and start reflecting necessity. Money creation stops being exceptional and becomes routine. Intervention is no longer a tool used in emergencies. It becomes a default operating mode. Markets learn to anticipate it. Institutions learn to depend on it. Participants adjust behavior accordingly. Risk-taking increases not because people feel reckless, but because caution is punished. Saving yields little. Conservatism falls behind. The system teaches everyone the same lesson: move forward or lose ground. This stage also reshapes how success is measured. Economic health is no longer defined by productivity, wages, or resilience. It is defined by asset prices, liquidity, and confidence indicators. As long as markets rise and volatility is contained, the system is declared healthy. Structural weaknesses are dismissed as manageable. Critics are labeled pessimists. Warning signs are reframed as growing pains. Language does much of the work here. Problems are not solved, they are renamed. This allows the system to function while drifting further from its foundations. Information asymmetry widens during this phase. Those closest to power see the constraints more clearly. They understand the system's dependence on confidence and liquidity. They hedge quietly. They diversify influence rather than assets. The broader population, meanwhile, is encouraged to participate more deeply. Retirement systems, savings, and social stability become increasingly tied to market performance. This creates a psychological trap. People defend the system because their future feels inseparable from it. Doubt becomes dangerous. Questioning the structure feels like self-sabotage. This dynamic reinforces itself until belief becomes compulsory. History shows that empires at this stage often experience long periods of apparent stability. Decline is uneven. There are rallies, recoveries, and moments of optimism. Each one reinforces the belief that the system is adapting successfully. But adaptation is not the same as recovery. Adaptation in late-stage systems often means redistributing stress rather than resolving it. Pressure is moved from one sector to another, from present to future, from visible to hidden. The total load does not decrease, it increases. Eventually, the system reaches a point where every solution creates new dependencies. Lower rates require higher leverage. Higher leverage requires greater intervention. Greater intervention requires stronger narratives. Each layer adds complexity and reduces transparency. Fewer people understand how the system works. Trust shifts from comprehension to authority. As long as institutions appear in control, participation continues. But control is increasingly performative. The system works because everyone expects it to, not because its foundations are sound. This is the stage where warning signs lose their power. Indicators flash red, but responses are immediate and overwhelming, muting their impact. Volatility spikes, then disappears. Crises are declared over before their causes are addressed. Each time this happens, the system survives, but at a cost. The cost is optionality. The ability to choose different paths narrows. The range of acceptable outcomes shrinks. What remains is momentum. Forward motion becomes the only viable strategy. Empires stop recovering at this stage because recovery implies reversal. It implies admitting excess, accepting loss, and reestablishing boundaries. Those actions threaten legitimacy. They disrupt expectations. They create visible pain. Late-stage systems are built to avoid visible pain at all costs, so they choose continuity instead, even when continuity requires ever greater effort, even when it erodes trust in the long run. The irony is that the more desperately a system tries to preserve stability, the more fragile it becomes. Understanding this stage is uncomfortable because it removes simple solutions. There is no policy tweak that restores resilience once dependency is entrenched. There is no painless reform that unwinds decades of accumulated imbalance. That is why leaders hesitate. That is why delay feels safer. But delay is itself a choice, and history suggests it is the choice that defines the moment empires stop recovering and begin merely enduring. The final phase unfolds not with collapse, but with acceptance. People adapt to conditions they once would have considered intolerable. Expectations shrink quietly. What would have sparked outrage in an earlier era is now met with resignation or rationalization. This is how late-stage systems persist. They do not convince people that everything is good. They convince people that nothing better is possible. Stability becomes relative. Risk becomes background noise. Survival replaces progress as the unspoken objective. And once that shift happens, recovery ceases to be the goal. Continuation does. At this stage, institutions are no longer oriented toward fixing root causes. They are oriented toward managing reactions. Every decision is filtered through the question of confidence. Will this reassure markets? Will this calm participants? Will this prevent panic? These questions dominate because panic is the one thing the system cannot survive. Not because panic itself is fatal, but because it exposes dependency. Once people realize that stability exists only as long as belief is maintained, belief becomes fragile. The system becomes reflexive. It reacts to its own reactions. That is a dangerous place to be. Late-stage empires often appear obsessed with narratives. Messaging becomes as important as policy. Numbers are framed carefully. Metrics are selected strategically. Optimism is encouraged not through evidence, but through repetition. None of this is entirely dishonest. Data can be interpreted many ways. But the emphasis reveals priorities. The goal is not to strengthen foundations, it is to preserve participation. As long as people stay invested, literally and psychologically, the system can function. Withdrawal is the true threat. This is why participation is expanded aggressively in the final stage. More people are brought into markets. More assets are financialized. More aspects of life are tied to system performance. Retirement, healthcare, housing, education, all become linked to financial conditions. This creates alignment, but also vulnerability. When everything depends on the same framework, diversification disappears. The system gains reach but loses redundancy. It becomes efficient and brittle at the same time. History shows that this phase can last longer than expected. Late Roman institutions persisted for generations after resilience was lost. British financial dominance lingered long after its economic base weakened. In each case, the system did not fail because it stopped working. It failed because it worked too well at postponing consequences. The longer postponement continues, the larger the eventual adjustment becomes. And when adjustment finally arrives, it feels sudden only because the crossing of the threshold happened quietly years earlier. One of the defining features of this stage is moral inversion. Actions once considered reckless are praised as necessary. Prudence is reframed as obstruction. Skepticism is labeled destabilizing. This does not happen through coercion, but through incentives. Those who align with the system are rewarded. Those who question it are marginalized. Over time, this shapes discourse. Debate narrows. Acceptable opinions cluster around continuity. Alternatives feel unrealistic, even when they are historically common. Another feature is generational disconnect. Those who lived through earlier corrections remember volatility as cleansing. They understand loss as part of recovery. Younger generations, raised entirely within late-stage conditions, know only intervention and support. For them, stability has always been managed. Markets have always been backstopped. This shapes expectations profoundly. Risk is assumed to be temporary. Downturns are expected to be reversed. When these assumptions are challenged, disbelief often precedes fear. At the individual level, behavior adapts in predictable ways. People chase returns not because they are greedy, but because standing still feels like falling behind. They tolerate leverage because safety nets appear implicit. They accept complexity because simplicity no longer seems rewarded. Each of these choices makes sense in isolation. Together, they lock participants deeper into the system. Exit becomes psychologically difficult long before it becomes structurally impossible. This is the stage where empires stop recovering, because recovery would require undoing incentives that people now depend on. It would require telling participants that past assumptions were wrong, that promised stability came at a cost, that losses must be realized rather than deferred. These messages are profoundly unpopular. They threaten trust not only in institutions, but in personal decisions made over decades, so they are avoided. Instead, continuity is framed as success, survival is framed as resilience. Eventually, however, limits assert themselves, not always through collapse, but through transformation. Systems reconfigure under pressure, power shifts, rules change, new frameworks emerge. Those moments are often described as sudden breaks. In reality, they are the consequence of long erosion. The empire did not fail to recover at the end. It stopped recovering much earlier, when correction became unacceptable. Understanding this does not require despair. It requires realism. Late-stage systems are not doomed in a cinematic sense. They are constrained. Their range of motion is limited. Their responses are predictable. For individuals and societies, recognizing the stage changes how decisions are made. It shifts focus from expecting restoration to preparing for transition. History rewards those who understand context, not those who cling to narratives of permanence. Empires stop recovering when they confuse survival with health, when avoiding pain becomes more important than restoring balance, when belief replaces resilience as the core stabilizer. That stage is not marked by collapse, but by rigidity. And rigidity, more than weakness, is what history punishes most severely. Those who recognize it early gain options. Those who don't are carried forward by momentum until momentum runs out. History does not announce when that happens. It only records the outcome.